Alright, so hello everyone, and welcome again to another episode of The Verdict. I'm SpraynPray1000, and today we're going to talk about Pokemon Let's Go Eevee, which is a game I played for the Nintendo Switch. I'm a huge fan of Pokemon. That is pretty much one of the few games I could honestly say I play pretty much every single day of my life. I enjoy playing Pokemon, and I've been playing it on the DS since it basically debuted on it in Diamond and Pearl. I started way back when I was playing Pokemon Gold on the Game Boy Advance. I mean, it was for the Game Boy Color, but I had it on the Game Boy Advance. And I've been a huge fan of the games ever since. I've played every generation. And the only game to this day of the main series I did not at least fully beat was Pokemon Black 2 and White 2, which I'm currently playing now. But enough about my history. We're here today to talk about the latest game in the series, which is the Let's Go games. Now, these were kind of unique games. They are basically hybrids of a mainstream Pokemon game, which is a reimagining, of Pokemon Yellow, and Pokemon Go, which is the 2016 mobile game that made such a huge splash when it came out. And this game kind of is a sequel more to Pokemon Go than it is a reimagining of Yellow. And while it does have a lot of cool aspects and show off a lot of cool things that the Switch can do with Pokemon, the real aspect of it is that it has connectivity with Pokemon Go, and it shares basically the same catching mechanic from the series of games. So, without further ado, I think we'll just jump into it. This should be more on the shorter end, because right off the bat, we can skip the story aspect almost entirely. This game is a remake of Pokemon Yellow. If you don't know the plot of Pokemon Yellow, you are a 10-year-old kid who lives in Pallet Town. You get your starter Pokemon, which in this game, unlike the mainstream games, you don't pick which Pokemon you get. Much like Pokemon Yellow, you are just simply given a starter based on what version you're playing. So, for instance, if you're playing Pokemon Eevee, you get an Eevee as a starter. Big surprise. And same thing with Pokemon Yellow. You get a Pikachu. Excuse me, it's Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee. I'm sorry. The next thing to really say about that is you go around, you collect 8 badges, you fight the villainous team of the region, which is again Team Rocket, and that is pretty much it. You fight the Elite Four and you win. And there's a little bit of post-game stuff here, but that brings me to the first issue that I have with this game. The post-game here, like pretty much all the Kanto games, except for the remakes, which were Fire Red and Leaf Green, is pretty shallow. You have the master trainers, which are cool, I guess, for about a few minutes, and I'll elaborate on that later. You have the Mewtwo challenge, and then you have a battle against Green. Now, the only thing that I will say is that Mewtwo and the master challenges, I mean, Mewtwo was in all the original games, but the master challenges are kind of just fights where you pit one of your Pokemon against someone who has an exact identical Pokemon. They appear all over Kanto after beating the game. It's content, but it's content in the blandest form, because it's not really like taking your best Pokemon team and fighting. No, you really just have to have just the better version of that Pokemon. And I'm really not a fan of it. Personally, I think that they could have had something more interesting. For instance, we know that in the remakes, Fire Red and Leaf Green, they have the whole Sevi Islands plotline, which was introduced to sort of expand on the games, not make them so strict to the remakes, which is funny because they were very strict to the originals and other variations in other ways. And to kind of give you a chance to get Johto Pokemon and just have something new to explore. So it's not just a clean-cut remake. And we see this a lot. In Heart Gold and Soul Silver, they added new places, new routes, new events, new everything. And same thing in Ore and Ass. But the biggest problem from this game comes that once you beat it, it's basically your typical Kanto game. I mean, it's nice to be able to play it in, on the big screen in HD, and it all works nice. I mean, it looks nice, but the gameplay of this game just kind of feels like it's missing something. And in one major aspect it is, and that would be the catching aspect. The catching aspect of this game is based off the Pokemon Go aspect, which is where you don't actually fight the Pokemon. You just throw Pokeballs at it. As a ring around it decreases, the closer you get the Pokeball to the center as the ring closes around it, the better chance you have of catching it, so on and so forth. Every Pokemon in your party gains experience upon catching a Pokemon, but this is probably the single worst design choice I think that they could put in a game like this, because they have completely removed wild battles as a source of natural experience gain. So with very few exceptions, namely legendary and special Pokemon like the Snorlaxes, every Pokemon in this game is caught in this manner. And you can of course use these Pokemon as you see fit. And you could swap out your Pokemon team almost at any time through the box, which you have located on your person now instead of in the PC. But the problem stems from the fact that while this is fun early on in the game, later on in the game, Pokemon become incredibly difficult to catch without using berries and other items to help make it easier. Pokemon also begin to appear, and it's very hard to kind of gain levels at that point because you need to do multiple Pokemon catches. And the worst part about it, if the catch rate being basically dropped into the toilet, mandating the use of Ultra Balls very, very early on, is not the worst part about it. It is guaranteed the fact that in order to catch Pokemon, the Joy-Con has to really work. And I had no luck throughout this entire playthrough of how to use the Joy-Con. You would do the same, it's the same thing I had with the Wii, the same exact problem, manifested in 2018. If you throw something once, works perfectly. Throw it 2 times more, works reasonably good. Okay, maybe it's a little variation. Throw it exactly the same again, ball goes completely off to nowhere. And it drives me crazy that we are still stuck with a mandatory option to have to use motion controls. There is no other option unless you play in handheld mode where you can then use gyroscope. But there is no normal option to just throw a Pokeball, aim it with the control stick or something. Nope, you have to do mandatory motion controls. And it's the same thing I didn't like about Super Mario Odyssey. And the number one thing I'm grateful about Breath of the Wild for, and it drives me insane, motion controls do not work that well. And it's unfortunate. Sometimes they do, sometimes it's great. Sometimes it's a really fun environment and fun and enjoyable. But the way that it works is that it tracks the motion of your arm and it tracks the whole motion of you throwing the Pokeball. And in an ideal world, it would then translate that to in-game, which is fine, and it's a cool idea on paper. Motion controls don't always work that way. The Pokemon jump around, and even when you land a Pokeball, you still have the chance of them just breaking out, because you basically need to start using high-powered Pokemon, or high-powered Pokeballs pretty early in the game. I'd say around the midway point, which kind of spits in the face of the original game series, where you can just simply catch a Pokemon by battling it until it's weak, and then just catching it, and that's it. There's no other hidden gimmick. There's nothing else. That's how the system has worked for literally 20 years at this point, and it's worked fine. And in that aspect, in that single aspect, I can say that this game is definitely inferior to the base games. And I understand that this is to keep it with the pogo element and all that other stuff, and that's fine, and I don't mind it being an option in the game if you really want to do this and deal with the motion controls. That's totally understandable, but a normal default option also helps, especially when this game is also considered to be a remake of Pokemon Yellow. It's not just a Pogo game, it's a remake of Pokemon Yellow. You could come into this game with no Pokemon Go interaction. You could come into it as a mainline gamer from the main series, and in that one aspect, I think it would have been fine to maybe have a nice hybrid of both. If they wanted to have the catching mechanic, that's understandable. Maybe have something like you battle the Pokemon like normal first, and then you have the option of either catching it when it gets weak, or you can knock it out and gain experience normally. Just in general stuff like that. The only aspect of this game that remains the same from the previous incarnations is that there are normal trainer battles. You can fight trainers like you always could. Nothing has changed in that aspect. And I like that about this game because it's what's good about Pokemon. It's the same sort of battling, but there's one key element that there's a couple key elements I don't really like about this game. While there are Mega Evolutions and other things, there's no Z moves, but there are Alolan forms of the various Pokemon from Gen 7 and Gen 1, and there are no abilities, which has been a staple of every game since Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire when they were introduced. And there's no held items, which has been something since Gen 2. So this game almost could not be any more stripped out of any sort of element of complexity. And that's pretty crazy considering that they tried to do that originally with the original Kanto remakes a little bit. But this game just completely takes all of that and throws it against the wall and says just none of it makes it in. And I think removing those key elements kind of boils Pokemon down to an almost gimmicky status of just every fight almost either being a complete steamroll in your favor or ridiculously complex and hard because you do not have options and access to things like abilities for your Pokemon. So because there's no abilities, for instance, certain Pokemon are now weak to certain things while others are not weak, and just the whole system gets kind of messed up. For instance, there's a couple of Pokemon that are weak to ground types, or that would be weak to ground types if it were not for their ability. So for instance, Coughing, which is poison type, has a weakness to ground in the usual rock, paper, scissors way that Pokemon works. And normally, since Gen 3, when abilities were introduced, Coughing always have Levitate as their ability, meaning that they are normally unaffected by ground type moves. In this game, you could just use ground type moves to completely steamroll them because abilities don't exist. It's the same problem that Gen 2 had with some of these Pokemon. And in general, a lot of this stuff was introduced for a good reason. Hell, even in the remakes, abilities were still around. You could still use abilities. And I think that just removing that in general, I get that they want to keep these games simple, but there is a certain degree of simplicity to which the game is no longer fun, because it's just either steamrolling or frustration with the catching. And I think that's my two biggest problems with the game. I mean, it looks fine, the frame rate could be better, but that's every Game Freak game since Pokemon X and Y. And other than that, I mean, I just feel like they could have done more, pretty much. I feel like, while it is a nice remake of Kanto, if they had had maybe a mode for normal players and then the Pogo mode where they kind of simplify everything, or just better combine the two aspects to have a more concise gameplay, then I would kind of agree with it. I would say that that's fine. But as it is now, I mean, even Pogo is kind of a game that's, you can play a lot, you can play it for a long time, but I don't really think it congeals itself to a normal Pokemon setup in the sense that you do the 8 badges, you do all the other stuff. So what I find is that while you beat the game, a lot of the post game is just flat out suffering because you have to do either grinding chances or just fighting opponents over and over because it's just very hard to sort of gain levels and level up. And while they do have some of the nice things from Gen 7 and Gen 6, like the Experience All feature and Mega Evolution, they cut out a lot of things that would have also made the game more fun and easy. And while they did add a lot of cool things like being able to set Pokemon's natures and being able to import them from Pogo, which I'm sure will be fun for a lot of people, the game kind of has this basic core problem with the catching. Pokemon always relied around catching, which is never changed and never will change. But the whole point of this game is that you catch a lot of Pokemon, you send the Pokemon you don't want to Professor Oak. Professor Oak will give you candies, which you can then use to buff the stats of your Pokemon. And from there, you use that to make the Pokemon you actually want to use better. Now, in reality, this is great at the start of the game because every Pokemon is an easy catch because the game is easy at the start, like every Pokemon game. I mean, Pokemon is not that challenging anyway, except for a few key instances, but it's just flat out pretty easy, right? Fast forward, and what ends up happening is, okay, that works out just fine. But when you're late in the game, when it's harder to catch Pokemon and you require more resources because you'll throw balls, they'll hit the Pokemon fine, they'll break out because, you know, whatever, that's the randomization, and you can't really influence it other than throwing berries, which you have of a limited supply, you just have to deal with it. You'll probably get less and less as you go along just through wasting resources from Pokemon breaking out, Pokemon running, which is a thing. Pokemon can now flee from wild encounters. In fact, all Pokemon will flee from encounters after so much time, which is sincerely infuriating because it can be anywhere from 2 Pokeballs to 5 Pokeballs, and then roughly around after that, they will pretty much be a high chance of running, and then you just have lost your resources. That's it. You're completely screwed. And I think that just in and of itself makes it infuriating. It makes it annoying as all hell to even attempt to try to catch this. And I really wish that they had maybe added more traditional battle mechanics. Like, again, weakening the Pokemon before you try to catch them, which is something that they drill into your head in every Pokemon game, is not in this game. Instead, you just throw Pokeballs at a Pokemon. And it would make more sense if you were allowed to battle them first, maybe get their health down a bit, and then maybe, okay, they're weak, they can't jump around as much, and they won't have as high a chance of breaking out. Then you can do it. Because that's the exact system that they have in place for some of the legendary Pokemon. For instance, the 3 legendary birds and Mewtwo and the Snorlax fights, you actually have to KO the Pokemon and then you have a chance at catching them. But what that really turns out in being is because you have to actually KO them, they just move around as normal. You just have to do the battle and win the battle within 5 minutes, which is an obnoxious time limit, to actually have a chance at being able to catch it. And that's how it works. And that is exactly what you have to look forward to. So, I mean, there's not much else to say about Pogo. I'm sorry, I keep saying Pogo. Pokemon Let's Go Eevee. I could assume the same is basically true for Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu. These versions are not that different. I've played them for years. Almost none of the paired versions are truly different games from each other besides rare Pokemon and exclusive Pokemon to encourage trading. But what would I say about Pokemon Let's Go Eevee? It's interesting because you have a lot of the cool elements from Pokemon Yellow, such as a partner Pokemon that will follow you around and occasionally interact with the overworld. They really want you to bond with it and have special scenes with it. You can't evolve your partner Pokemon like in Yellow, which is based off the anime. And you also have walking Pokemon, which is a cool thing to have return. It's set in everyone's favorite region of Kanto, which, you know, everyone loves Kanto. It's just kind of their shtick. And I don't have a problem with that necessarily. I just think that the lack of adding anything else is a problem. I think that the catching mechanic completely screws up the balance and flow of the game. Even though it might be fun initially, I think that the gimmickiness of the mandatory motion control gameplay eventually hinders and dampens it. I think that the battling is cool, but they removed aspects such as abilities. They removed held items. They removed a bunch of other things that made Pokemon more complex and interesting and fun to plan around and figure out. And just in general, I think the performance could be better. I think there's a lot of things wrong with this game. And I'm not saying it in the sense that like the game sucks and it's a completely unfun experience. Quite the opposite. But as someone who's played Pokemon games for a long time and played better Pokemon games for a long time, I think that it's safe to say that this game could be, not even easier, just could be better. So I'm going to give this game a 72 out of 100. The gameplay pretty much, once again, like with Darksiders 3, which I just reviewed, completely takes a swath out of this entire review. The gameplay in and of itself bumps this game down to a 75 in my opinion. And just the other points just come from other various things, such as the performance, just, you know, nothing new here. And there's a lot of cool, cute touches, but once you've beaten the game, a lot of these cool, cute touches just don't really matter that much anymore. It's kind of a one-time experience, and that's cool and fun, but for $60 for a remake of a game that's already been remade to some degree, which is Fire Red and Leaf Green, I would prefer playing Fire Red and Leaf Green to this game. If they had made a modernized Fire Red and Leaf Green, I would have probably enjoyed that more. But I digress. That's it for this episode of The Verdict. I am SpraynPray1000. Gen 8. I mean, they specifically said that this game is not like Gen 8, so I guess we'll have to wait and see, huh? But I'm SpraynPray1000, and I will see you guys next time on The Verdict. Take care.